Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dan Wallace. I am the president of Most Insurance Services. We are a program manager for a new custom loss assessment unit owner program for common interest developments throughout the country. Today, we've invited some of our large scale communities in Southern California. And today, to educate everyone on earthquakes and best practices for boards and unit owners, we brought Dr. Lucy Jones. And we brought in Adrian Adams. Now, Dr. Lucy Jones is the foremost and most trusted voice in the country when it comes to seismology. She's been labeled as the seismologist next door. She has a very incredible background, and she started her career going to school at Brown University, where she graduated magna cum laude. From there, she went to MIT and got her PhD in geophysics. Was it? Yeah, something like that. From there, I think in 1979, I think I have this timetable correctly, she went to China and worked with the Chinese Earthquake Authority to build up their I guess really was the creation of their kind of USGS.
Well, it was to understand, they were claiming they were predicting earthquakes at that point, and we needed to understand what they were doing.
Okay. Well, she was the first scientist allowed in China in 1979. From there, she went to Columbia for a post-research doctorate. And then from there, she spent 30 years out in Pasadena with the California Institute of Technology, leading the USGS. During her 30 years with the USGS, she was 9 years, she was the scientist in charge. And during those 30 years, some of her research and the program she's instituted, some of them, the names that you will have heard is like the Great Shakeout. I think it's how many millions of people participate in the Great Shakeout every year now?
2019, we had 62 million people around the world. The pandemic cut into it.
Just wild. And, her research is what leads my insurance carriers and my reinsurance carriers use what she's worked on with her scientists that she was overseeing to create rates. So that we can offer you something that you can afford, which we'll talk about, which hasn't been too affordable of late. But with that, I won't step on Dr. Lucy Jones' toes too much. She's got to get out of here, but she's obviously such a wonderful person here, and it's going to be incredible for everyone. She just makes earthquakes so understandable for all of us. So
take it away. Okay, let me share my screen. And thank you all for having, oh, wait a minute. Sorry, I did this wrong again. There we go. Thank you for having me. And I'm got a bit of a presentation here, and then of course we can have questions later. Since we're mostly Southern Californians here, I am sure you all remember what happened in 1994. If you're too young, you would have heard about it. The collapse of the Northridge Meadows apartment complex led to the death of 17 people and helped highlight the issues that can be around for multifamily dwellings. I think what many people don't know is that this was far from the only building that had problems. And in fact, we lost 49,000 housing units. 49,000 more families became homeless because of damage in this earthquake. And that's one of the biggest impacts that we expect from the really big earthquakes. When we model what a San Andreas earthquake would do, we look at 250,000 households no longer having a place to call home. So today, I'm going to help you understand why we face that particular risk, especially here in Southern California, how the earthquakes cause damage, because by understanding that, you can do a better job of understanding what you can fix and what you can insure against. And especially what are the types of buildings that are the worst, and for the purpose of being able to help your community be better prepared and better able to face what is an inevitable part of our future. I'm going to start with the basics, make sure we all know what an earthquake is. To a seismologist, the earthquake is the sudden slip of one block of rock past another that produces shaking as one of its effects. And in fact, if you look at the picture on the right, you can see how this rice paddy, this is in Kobe, Japan in the 95 earthquake, the ground moved along the fault a distance of about 6 feet, offsetting those rows within the rice paddy. And this happens in every earthquake, and it's the movement of the fault that's the primary event, and it produces shaking as one of its effects. Just like when I snap my fingers, I move my fingers past each other, and one of the results of that is to produce a sound wave that causes the air to vibrate. These faults, the earthquake has to happen on a fault. A little earthquake will be on a little fault. You won't, be able to see it. It doesn't have to come to the surface of the earth. In the biggest earthquakes, they often do. This was in New Zealand in 2017. This fault, actually about 20 faults were involved. They kept on triggering each other in this earthquake. And as you can see, spreading off across the landscape. When it's happened here in California, we get events like this. In 1940, it ruptured through this lemon orchard. And it's not that the farmer didn't know how to plant straight lines on his trees, but rather that the fault came through there on the running from the upper left to the lower right and offset those trees. So this happens in every earthquake. It is the earthquake. It can't be stopped. If that fault runs through your house is now going to be offset. There's no way around it. In the Sylmar earthquake in 1971, the fault primarily moved vertically. We saw mostly horizontal ones. Well, the New Zealand one also moved vertically. That vertical offset came up through these houses and destroyed them. Because of that, the state of California passed a law called the Aquas Priolo Act, passed in 1978, so that you don't build a building across an active fault. It does not require removing buildings that were already there, and therefore you can be grandfathered in. But it also, and of course, big units, more than 4 housing units, this is what it applies to. And so you'll see, especially out in the Coachella Valley communities where they're built around a green space. That green space might be the San Andreas Fault running through, and they're making sure that none of the buildings that are actually on it. Right? In general, though, this is relatively rare, and what really affects us is the shaking. So the shaking is produced by this movement of the fault. The size of the fault determines how much movement is created, and we measure the size of the earthquake with magnitude, but the degree of shaking with intensity. What you feel does not tell you the magnitude. Because this gets rather complicated, I'm going to use a little movie that I have I've made for a different program to help explain this and give you visuals so you can see what it's like during an earthquake itself. Dan, let me know if we're not hearing the sound.
Magnitude is one number representing the total energy released in the earthquake.
Sounds
It was
great.
developed here at Caltech by Bino Gutenberg and Charles Richter. And they were trying to express the idea that there is an innate size to the earthquake that is not what you feel. Because there would be an earthquake, like in Inglewood, and people in Inglewood felt it very differently from the people here in Pasadena, and they would talk about it as though it were 2 separate earthquakes. So they were trying to get through that idea that there's an innate size that is not what you feel. We have been talking about magnitude for so long, there's a lot of people who think magnitude's what you feel, right? And actually that is expressed with something called intensity. So we use the modified Mercalli intensity scale here in the United States. It was the original Mercalli scale, was developed in the 19th century. It preceded the idea of magnitude. And it is a subjective description, originally, describing the impact and what you feel. Intensity 1 means nobody felt it. Intensity 3 is the type of thing that if you're sitting still, you really notice it, but maybe if you're walking around, you miss it, the fact that it's happening. By the time you get up to intensity 5, that's a level at which you'll see, everybody notices it. You start having people being frightened and really wondering what's going to be happening. Lots of noise as things get shaken around, but unlikely that anything's actually thrown off of a shelf. That's intensity 6 is sort of the definition of that level at which you're starting to really see things thrown off of shelves. A California building is probably fine at that level. An old masonry building without any retrofitting or any reinforcement, those start coming down at intensity 6. By intensity 7, you're seeing older buildings faring poorly, Even like the wood frame stucco construction, if they weren't bolted to their foundation, they can be shifted off at that level, or the cripple wall around the crawl space can be broken down. By the time you get to intensity 9, that's where we're seeing big buildings coming down, and you see the collapse of concrete structures. We've seen collapse of freeway bridges at that level. Intensity 10 is actually the largest one we use now, and might be involved with derailing trains and things being thrown into the air, accelerations literally exceeding the force of gravity. We've seen earthquakes where after the event, we have upside down grand pianos or upside down VW buses. So things do get literally thrown in the air. We can have accelerations exceeding the force of gravity when we get to our biggest ones. But that's only for our biggest earthquakes and when you are very nearby.
So the reason this is important is to realize that it's that intensity 8, 9, 10 where damage is really happening. So we will have plenty of people feeling an earthquake, scared by an earthquake, but not receiving the strong shaking. And the difference is very large. It also means that for every earthquake, you have a map of intensities. You have one epicenter, you have one magnitude, but you have an area that has been affected by this. Notice I say one epicenter. That is the place on which the earthquake begins, the place on the fault where you first start moving. But the rupture moves down the fault and will break a significant part of the fault potentially. If it breaks a very small amount of the fault, you have a small earthquake. If it breaks a lot of the fault, you have a big earthquake because every point on the fault is giving off shaking. Right? So here on the left, you can see here's how long the faults are for different magnitudes. So Northridge was only 15 kilometers across. It was small for, it's the lowest one at 6.7, right? To get up to close to magnitude 8, the big earthquakes we've had in California, those are faults that are like 400 kilometers, 250 miles long. And that only gets you to magnitude 7.8, right? It also means that the duration of the earthquake scales with the magnitude because the rupture begins at that epicenter, moves down the fault at the speed of sound in rock, which is about 2 kilometers a second. And so the biggest earthquakes last for a much longer time. When you just feel that one jolt, you know that it's under magnitude 5. When we get to a magnitude 7, it's going to be going on for 20 seconds or so, and a magnitude 8 will be going on for a couple of minutes. Just to put it in context, the biggest earthquake we've ever recorded in the world was in Chile in 1960, and it lasted for 11 minutes. The fault was longer than the state of California. So we can feel lucky that in California, we don't quite get like that. So let's take a moment to look what it means to have a San Andreas earthquake. On the left of this picture, you see the red line. That's the San Andreas fault. The part of it that's in red is the part that we modeled as breaking in an earthquake that we called the shakeout earthquake. The shakeout drill began as a way to explain this model where we were really trying to bring the best science to say what's going to happen. Right? So as you can see on the left, you see the map of where it is, and you're now starting to see colors coming out. We are having the rupture move up the fault. We are now 10 seconds into the earthquake, and you can see it still hasn't even made it to Palm Springs. On the right, we are overlooking Palm Springs. And you can see that at first you feel the first wave, the P, what's called the P wave, and then the S wave comes through. And because you're right on the fault and you have a big bowl of sediment, and by the way, Huntington Beach, you have just as much sediment as the Coachella Valley, you get this type of amplification. Now, this is going to happen when you're really near the fault. The shaking in Palm Springs in this earthquake will be extreme. But now let's look back over on the left and look at where else we are seeing these impacts. We're now only 50 seconds into the earthquake, and the shaking has just barely begun in the Los Angeles area. But as the earthquake goes on, remember I said it's going to last for a long time. It's 100 seconds in this model that the fault is moving, and then the waves have to move from the fault out to the various communities. So you're 75 seconds into it before the strong shaking gets into the Los Angeles basin. This is the reason we are able to do what's called earthquake early warning, is we use this information that the earthquake's already begun and get it to you before the shaking has actually gotten to where you are. Remember what we saw, intensity 9, the place where there's lots of damage, that's the ones that are in red. And even though the Los Angeles basin is a relatively long ways away from the fault, we are seeing these pockets of red because of the deep basin of the Los Angeles basin trapping and amplifying the shaking. If we go back and think about what happened in 1994 again, instead of a 200 kilometer or 200 mile long fault, the fault is about 10 miles across in Northridge. We show it as a square because it's not vertical into the earth, it's dipping at an angle. You can see how the intensity 9 is basically only right on top of that fault. And it's also where most of the damage was. The good news is the shaking, the damage dies off really quickly with distance from the fault. The bad news is when you're right on top of the fault, it's a lot worse than anywhere else. So do not think because your community in Huntington Beach had no trouble in Northridge that means anything. It really means nothing at all. Right? When you're right on top of it, it is going to be very different. And essentially everywhere in Southern California has a fault nearby. We don't know which ones are going to be the next one, which is why we get insurance. Okay, why do we have so many faults in Southern California? The basics is that we have the San Andreas comes through the area. That's the plate boundary. The Pacific Ocean is moving to the northwest compared to North America, moving to the southeast. And so just like the Bay Area has the San Andreas and the Hayward Fault accomplishing that motion. We have the San Andreas and the San Jacinto, the Elsinore and the Newport Inglewood all accomplishing that northwestward motion. But we have a complication in that there is a big bend in the fault here in Southern California, probably because of the Garlock Fault, and that's a whole other talk that doesn't really inform insurance decisions. If you want to, go do a Google search on how the Garlock Fault affects the San Andreas if you want to know more. But because the San Andreas is offset, now when we move along the fault, we are pushing it together. And that pushes up, that makes more faults and pushes up more mountains. Just like this picture of the Cucamonga Fault, this is we're over the Inland Empire here. The top right is Cajon Pass, where this I-15 crosses the San Andreas Fault. Those mountains are there because the Cucamonga Fault is pushing it up faster than erosion can bring them down. We have a few hundred active faults in Southern California because of the Big Bend and all of those complications. Most of them don't move very often, but there's a lot of them. And so it means that all of us have some risk. If you look at how the seismologists talk to engineers about the risk, you get pictures like this. This is what's called a seismic hazard map, in which we take all of our known faults. We predict their magnitude by length. We estimate the shaking from the magnitude. We then plot out what intensities they're going to be getting from each one of those, how often each one of them happens, and sum them up. And you can see that the Bay Area and Southern California end up being the Los Angeles, Orange County, Riverside area, end up with the highest rates because we've built these major communities near the San Andreas Fault, because the San Andreas Fault gives us things like the San Francisco Bay and the mountains that trap our clouds and give us rain. It's an unfortunate feature all around the world that faults make good places to live. Right? What you should not do, though, is look at this map and say, hey, I'm down near San Diego. I'm less than you guys. I don't have to worry about it. Well, you do have to worry about it because we don't know which one's going to be next. And there is a fault that runs through downtown San Diego that's capable of a magnitude 7 and probably moves about once every 1,000 years, which is as active as most of our faults, with the exception of the San Andreas and San Jacinto, which move more quickly. So how do you live with it? I like to talk about what I call the resilience equation. When you look at what can happen to us, how do I define what my risk is? Well, my risk is going to be the hazard, what the earth does, all of those faults, all of the times at which they can move, the faulting, or perhaps the landslides that will get triggered by the faulting, all of those, inevitable, this is what the earth does. But we have to then multiply that hazard by what we have exposed to it. How many buildings have we put near these different faults? And what's our density, right? But not just what our exposure is, but what's our fragility? How well did we make those buildings? Because I'm going to try to convince you today that the earthquake isn't inevitable, but the disaster is not. And we really could be doing a better job of building our buildings to withstand all this. So these all make it more dangerous. We can improve our resilience, reduce our risk by doing a good job of responding to the events. And the other part that often gets forgotten, but is incredibly important, is what I call the will to recover. Often the majority of the losses happen after the event as the community struggles to come back and perhaps the economy doesn't recover. So if we've got these 5 factors, what can we do about them? Well, first we have our hazard. I hopefully have convinced you that we can't, or that we can't move away from that. Right? The Earth's going to do what the Earth's going to do. We could think that we could deal with it by understanding the time. And emotionally, that is something we want very, very much. You know, when you look at how human beings became human, it was our ability out on the savannah to recognize that the moving grass might be hiding a hidden predator. Our ability to theorize from some set of data about something else and create a pattern that told us whether or not we were safe. Our ability to do that is how we evolved to become modern humans. You know, when you can connect that mushroom you ate with the gastrointestinal distress that you're suffering, that's going to help keep you alive. Our problem is we don't have an internal fact checker, and we have a way of making patterns even when they're not there. Completely random distribution of stars we've turned into pictures of the constellations and stories. So when you hear about predictions, anybody saying, wait, I've heard that such and such is happening, or this makes making it more likely, or, you know, that earthquake in Japan, maybe it's going to set off something here. These are the need for patterns that we are trying to believe in. And the point of science is to go in and test them and see whether or not they're actually true, and they're not. But it's something we do in every situation. It is particularly common in disasters. In fact, if you look at the word disaster itself, it literally means ill-starred. It was first used by Shakespeare, and it represents our belief that our fate is written in the stars, and that things like these disasters, which are completely random, but we can't accept it, and we create a pattern. Okay? So if earthquake prediction, you know, are we doing any better than patterns? We do better on where they happen. For instance, here's a map of the earthquakes over 30 years here in, or 20 years here in Southern California. You know, we've had almost, 700,000 earthquakes in 40 years. Right? It has been, we have them all the time, and you can see they form pretty distinct patterns. Some of them are the aftershock zones to big earthquakes, but primarily they are connected to where we have our big faults and where we're seeing this motion that's being driven by plate tectonics. But we want to know which one of these is happening in our lifetime, and we want to believe it's something more than the random distribution. Clearly, over the whole catalog, we've tested every way we can think of, and the only non-random part is aftershocks. When one earthquake happens, others become more likely. But other than that, the timing is random. You might think that if you can go into an individual fault like the San Andreas and say, you've got to push on the fault till it breaks, just like snapping your fingers, shouldn't we be able to see some pattern in time? Well, we have, of course, we've only got one earthquake since we have written records in the state. So geologists have gone in and dug into the fault and doing really accurate work that takes many years of many geologists, came up with 10 data points of when the big earthquakes have happened. Up near Fraser Park is the data I'm going to be showing you on the San Andreas. Here is the time between earthquakes in Fraser Park on the San Andreas. And you can see they average about 100 years apart. But that doesn't tell you that 100 years is the most likely time. In fact, we've had them as close. We've had 3 of them that were less than 50 years apart. And we have one that's over 300 years apart. And in fact, when we put these data together, wherever we've been able to get it, we end up saying that it's best fit as a random distribution, that basically every year has the same about 1% chance of having a San Andreas earthquake, no, a 0.1% chance of having an earthquake on the Newport Inglewood Fault, and comparable sorts of numbers over all those other faults that we have. So we can't use the time. We've got to accept that the hazard's there and we can't do much about it. We also can't do much about the exposure. You know, we've already built our cities, they're already here. We can't pick them up and move them. We have to get to fragility before we can start doing something about it. And I think much more than people realize, fragility is within our control. Unfortunately, I can't show you a great example in the United States. I need to go to Japan to show you. If you remember, a decade ago, we had this magnitude 9 that happened off of Sendai off of northern Japan. The Japanese intensity scale is slightly different than ours, but basically where it's red and brown, that's the same thing, or red and dark red. That's the same thing that we have as our intensity 9. You can see most of northern Japan had that. Sendai was the closest. It had the closest big city. This is what it looked like after the earthquake. They had essentially no damage. For a magnitude 9, there were a total of about 100 people killed in the earthquake itself, most 150, mostly in older construction, right? Because changing a building code doesn't get an old building to disappear. And the great losses that they suffered were really because of the tsunami, which is not a risk, particularly here in Southern California. So let's begin with the acceptance that mitigation works. You can change how your buildings respond. When you come back to California and think about what our problems are, our biggest problems are in our older buildings, especially brick buildings are probably the worst. We haven't allowed them to be built since 1933, destroyed so many of them in the Long Beach earthquake, but they're still around. Every community in Los Angeles County has a mandatory retrofit program for these buildings, less so elsewhere in the state. Across the state, it's about half of the communities have mandatory retrofit. Okay. But it's unlikely that you've got a condo association in an unreinforced masonry building. Much more likely that you've got something in a soft first story building. These are ones where the ground floor is used for parking, and you have weaknesses just because, you know, you've either got a garage door or you've got, you know, poles holding up this lower part, and that makes the first floor weaker than the second. So when the building starts being shaken, the rigid upper part of the building concentrates shaking down into that weak first story. And you're better off if the whole building is weak than having just the first story weak. This is a really big known problem. A lot of communities have started doing with it. The city of Los Angeles and a dozen others have passed mandatory retrofit for these buildings. I will also tell you it's the most cost-effective one available to us. You get $22 back for every dollar spent, even including the unknown time to the next earthquake and the cost of money, the fact that you're investing the money now and not later. This is a very cost-effective approach. Non-ductile concrete buildings are a much bigger problem. They aren't as much of our residential community, but in the really biggest apartments, they can be. They are not only weak, they tend to be deadly when they collapse because the concrete is so heavy. Only the city of Los Angeles and I think Santa Monica and maybe Burbank have moved towards retrofitting these buildings on a mandatory basis. The other thing is steel buildings were supposed to be great, but it was, we discovered that the welds in the buildings can cause problems. This is the collapse of one floor. You can see how the floor collapsed of a steel moment frame building in Kobe, Japan in 1995. This is an existing problem that continues to hang out there. So as I already said, retrofit just does an amazing job. Getting rid of these soft first story type of construction is the most cost-effective thing. You may or may not have a mandate in your community, but it's very, very cost-effective. It's easy to think that, those are the older buildings. Those are the ones we figured out bad problems. We've gotten rid of them. They're not in the building code. Our building code is supposed to protect us, right? Well, philosophically, Californians have said, or Americans have said, that if you choose to make a bad financial decision, that's your problem and you get to suffer from it. And the role of government is to make sure you don't kill somebody in the process. So in fact, our building code is solely about life safety. It doesn't say a thing about whether or not the building's a total financial loss after it. It mainly says it shouldn't collapse because collapse is what kills people. And in fact, because the really strong shaking is rare and it costs more money to build it stronger, we've compromised even on that. And what we say is actually that in the worst earthquake, it needs a 90% chance of not collapsing. The problem is that's great for an individual building. When you think about it for a whole community, that means you're accepting that 10% of our new buildings will collapse when faced with this level of shaking, and it is likely to be the financial damage is even higher. Now, in fact, at least 90%, engineers tend to be a bit more conservative of that. We've seen it's rare to see a collapse of a modern engineered building, but severe financial damage is not rare. I'm going to take you now to Christchurch, New Zealand, a city of about 450,000 people. This is what it looked like in 2010. The construction techniques, they are very much like what we have in California. We're both both cultures that came out of England. Our buildings tend to look the same, and we follow the same building code. Now, they had an earthquake in 2011, literally in the middle of the city. So you can see that line of smoke coming up. That's actually the fault moving. This was taken during the earthquake. Somebody was up on a hill, saw it happen, and got this picture. And that shaking is the fault. So the dust clouds is the fault. So it was literally in the middle of the city. What it ends up being is that this is what was for Christchurch the design earthquake. Our building code is designed to even out the risk. It says that the worst shaking you're going to get needs to have this standard. And so whenever you get your design earthquake, the one that they said, this is the maximum we should be designing for, we're supposed to have the same outcome in all the different cities. So this was Christchurch's design earthquake. Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles, the design earthquake is bigger, stronger shaking than this. Huntington Beach is probably about the same. Obviously, Coachella Valley, it's worse shaking because you've got the San Andreas right there beside you. Okay. So this is a test of what our building code does in the design earthquake. And it did what it was supposed to. There were two buildings that collapsed. Both of them were older, they were mid-1960s non-ductile concrete buildings, which is a big thing that we're worried about here. And all of the modern buildings did not collapse. There were no lives lost. So the building official said, see, we did our job. This is what Christchurch looked like a few years later, because even though the buildings didn't kill people, 1,800 of them had to be torn down. They were a total financial loss. So our current building code is not guaranteeing your financial investment. Our current building code says, you lose the money, that's your choice. We're only making sure you don't kill people. So that's how far we've gotten with fragility here in California. You can think we tend to focus more on response. That's where emotionally we go. When we see that danger, we see the damage, we want to help. We invest about 8 times as much money for response as we do for prevention. And it's, we do pretty well here. The one thing I would point out to you is that an earthquake is not a one-time event. Remember, I said every earthquake makes another earthquake more likely, and we will have aftershocks. The way it works, if it's on here, I'm showing in the upper part, we have the probability of an earthquake versus various magnitude of earthquakes happen. So you have a small earthquake, you get an increase in probability for a bit of time. So every time you feel an earthquake, you got a 5% chance you're going to feel something bigger within the next day. That's a nice, it's approximate. That's a rule of thumb. You can, 1 in 20 times after you felt something, you'll feel something bigger. If you remember, I don't know if you felt the 2019 Ridgecrest earthquakes, the magnitude 7.1 on July 5th, there had been a 6.4 on July 4th. And here it was followed by that main shock. Right? So, but every time we've got that little earthquake, we have an increased probability. Sometimes it will trigger others. And then we get our big main shock, and we have, then we still have a lot of earthquakes after that, right? So I was actually, I'm not going to go through that detail. I would make the point, though, that mostly the aftershocks are very near where the main shock happened, and ditto for, of course, foreshocks. So every earthquake makes another more likely, but mostly nearby. And by the time you get more than the length of the fault that goes in that earthquake farther away from it, it becomes much less likely. Right? So if you to understand this, look at 2019. There's the fault. I don't know if you can see up in the upper middle of the screen. I put a gray line through the fault in the 2019 earthquake. You can see how there's all those aftershocks there. Most of the aftershocks are going to be within one fault length. So that fault, you can see the length of it. Anything within that length of the fault is something we'll call an aftershock. For a few days, we will see some increased risk at 2 or 3 times, or 3 to 4 times larger than that, which I'm showing here. You can see it barely touched the San Andreas. And this is why the seismologists were not particularly concerned about setting something off on the San Andreas, even though the media tried to make a big deal of it, because it was just too far away. So in that response time, yes, do a great job, but remember, you're going to be dealing with aftershocks while you do it. And the aftershocks have a psychological impact of people. It's sort of re-traumatizing. PTSD keeps on coming back. They don't want to stay around. Let's get to my last quantity, the will to recover, because I think that you're going to understand is that when you've had this disruption, it's hard for people to stay. They're traumatized. And if they've lost too much money, if they've lost their job, if the infrastructure is disrupted, if they can't get a shower because there's no water in their house, how much are they willing to stay and work on it? And when you think about what an earthquake is, every picture I've seen of people in this sort of condition, it is really upsetting, and you have to work to get out of it. And you need to be able to find a way to want to stay. And you want to do it relatively quickly because people have resilience, but they get worn down. So the most important question is, how do we speed up recovery? And we've got a little bit of a model here to think about it, where we're representing the activity of the of a region with their the wealth and economic activity. You have people own things, they get destroyed in the earthquake, but there's also, businesses and, operating, and when the electricity is taken out, they can't get back. So immediately we have a huge drop in both assets and economic development. And what we're trying to do is to recover, get back to what we should have been as quickly as possible. And I think you can really argue we did that with Northridge. People had about 40% of the houses damaged in Northridge had earthquake insurance. They hired contractors, they hired subcontractors, they had jobs, they got the economic engine up and going again. And some people even argue that Northridge got us out of a recession. But it doesn't have to happen that way. We call it a catastrophe when it can't get going, when there's just too much disruption. I mean, think of what happened to New Orleans after Katrina. It is still quite a bit a smaller city. People were forced to leave and they just didn't come back. And if you compare the area under the curves of these two models, that's really your total losses in the event. And you can see that not being able to recover can dwarf the losses you experience directly in the earthquake, and that can be the difference of your long-term financial health coming out of this. So how do we make sure we keep up on that disaster curve and not on the catastrophe curve? One of them is mitigation. If things weren't broken in the first place, you don't need to repair them and you don't need to respond to them. Right? Planning also helps. I mean, if you as a community have talked together about how you're going to do it and how you're going to help each other when things are disrupted, you're going to do a lot better. You're going to convince people they want to stay because their neighbors have helped them. And you're also going to be in a better position to get out there and get resources and get moving. But the other part that we have to admit, and we saw it in Northridge, we've seen it over and over again, is that a quick influx of money makes a big difference. You need to have the resources to come back. And so insurance is an incredibly important role. and California is still struggling to do that right. Because when we get down to it, resilience is a society that's still functioning after the disaster. And that happens because we've planned for it beforehand. Thank you.